Mr. Dodd, that bill is out. Congratulations. We're now going to leave the roll open on AJR 4 and start our informational and oversight hearing regarding implementation of Proposition 1, the water bond. Please be patient if at some point during our informational hearing I need to pause to allow members to add their votes to the previous measure. That said, I would like to welcome our members, our distinguished panelists, and the public. Am I moving in too fast for this? I would also like to welcome all right. Welcome all the members of the public who are joining us today. As I was preparing for this hearing, I was reflecting on the fact that the history of water development in California is filled with spectacular successes and devastating failures, often with respect to the same projects. Sometimes one region has benefited at the expense of another, or sometimes the economy has grown even as we decimated the environment. We've gotten better at balancing our needs, but we must go further and continuously strive to improve. After all, California is a launching pad for innovation. Just this month, the magazine Scientific American focused on the nexus between energy, water, and food. The point of the article was that increasingly, our challenges must be solved in an integrated way, and that we simply cannot afford to work in silos any longer. The future of the very planet may depend upon it. Today, we will be discussing Proposition 1. Prop 1 is an over $7.5 billion investment in our water future that took years to draft and pass. It is also an unprecedented opportunity for us to integrate, maximize, and balance California's water quality, water supply, and environmental needs, to innovate in ways that the Scientific American article highlighted so well. In his proposed budget, released last month, Governor Brown has set out an initial $532.5 million of Proposition 1 spending, but that is only the start of the Proposition 1 conversation. So there are multiple goals for today's hearing: to learn how the agencies are proposing to turn those funds into projects and programs, how they will ensure accountability, and also to receive recommendations and considerations for how we should maximize the public benefits of Proposition 1 dollars as we move forward. Before we proceed further, are there any other members who would like to make some brief opening comments or remarks? All right, thank you. Here's how I would like to conduct today's hearing. First, Anton Favarini-Zorba from the Legislative Analyst's Office is going to come up and provide a brief overview of Proposition 1 and some recommendations for our consideration. Following any Q&A, I would then like the second panel to come up as a group. Mr. Favarini-Zorba, please join us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Anton Favarini-Zorba with the Legislative Analyst's Office. So what we've been asked to do is provide you a brief bit of background on Proposition 1 and the governor's proposals, as well as just generally how bonds work, how bond funds are expended, and then also discuss some of the principles that we've identified in order to ensure that bond funding delivers the most public benefits for the dollar spent. With that, I'd like to note that the presentation, the handout that's being passed around, is also available on our website, lao.ca.gov, for those who would like to follow along in our watching the webcast. And we also have a report that is the basis for much of what we're about to say that will be available tomorrow, again online or in print version. So keep an eye out for that. That'll have a lot more detail, including our specific responses to the governor's proposals. But for now, let me turn to the overview of Proposition 1. As you all remember, voters approved Proposition 1 in November 2014. And what the measure does is it provides $7.5 billion for various water-related projects. On page 1 of the handout, we have a table that has a high-level summary of what the different types of projects are, as well as how much money was allocated to them. You'll note that the two biggest allocations are $2.7 billion for water storage and nearly $1.5 billion for ecosystem restoration. One note about the $7.5 billion total. Of that amount, $425 million was redirected from already approved bond measures, and so what that means is that made more money available for the projects that are laid out in this bond. It doesn't necessarily have to be spent consistent with the previous bond measures. I'm happy to talk more about the details of why that money was available in the questions if you're interested. I think turning to page 2, I'd like to walk you through just the basic process for how bond funds are spent, as well as kind of some particular aspects of Proposition 1 that will affect that. So I think the first point is that the $2.7 billion for water storage projects is continuously appropriated to the California Water Commission, and that means that it doesn't have to go through the annual state budget process. However, for the remaining funding in the measure, the legislature would appropriate that funding. They'd allocate it to specific departments, and the way that would work is typically because these appropriations would be for capital projects, so longer term, takes a little bit of time to construct them. The appropriation allows a state department to encumber or commit the funds to a project anytime within the next 3 years after the appropriation, and then another 2 years to actually spend the dollars for the money to go out the door. And the reason for that is, first, the projects have to get built, and then the state typically reimburses local agencies after they've either begun work on the project or completed it. The next step in the process is that departments will select the projects, typically through a competitive process. And in most cases, local agencies that would receive funding under the measure have to provide some matching funds, typically about 50% of the total project cost. Once projects are selected by the departments, then the state goes through the process of selling bonds. And essentially, the Department of Finance and the Treasurer and the department coordinate their activities so that we're only selling the bonds, going out to market, and starting to borrow once there's actually a need to pay for a project, once we need the cash on hand. The final note about the bond process is then after those bonds are sold, the state repays those bonds kind of like a mortgage over time. In this case, it's typically about 30 years from the time that the bond is sold. And so what we estimate the annual cost of the repaying the bonds as well as the interest on them is about $360 million per year for the next 40 years. As the chair alluded to, the governor has several proposals out there this year for the first year of implementation of the bond measure. If you look on page 3 of the handout, we have a chart that lays out all of the proposed appropriations and their purposes. I think a couple things to note about this. The largest area of expenditure would be for watershed restoration and protection. A fair amount of that money would go to the 10 state conservancies and the Ocean Protection Council. That's $84 million in total. And then the next largest allocation would be for the Wildlife Conservation Board, which would begin implementing its program to enhance stream flows, increase the amount of water flowing through streams. So I think with that, we'll talk about some of the principles that we've identified that we think can be helpful to ensure that bond funds are spent cost effectively and that there's adequate oversight, that you, the legislature, have the ability to oversee the entire process from project selection to the outcomes that the projects would provide. So the first principle is to ensure that the proposals further the state's priorities, and that can include the priorities that have been laid out in Proposition 1, which we have a figure on in the handout on page 4. It can also include consideration of priorities in other state legislation. So you might want to consider the Delta Reform Act of 2009, which set out some of the state's goals for achieving certain ends in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. That's an important area, as I'm sure all of you know, for the state's biodiversity as well as the state's water supply. You might also want to consider, to the extent that this aligns with AB 32, or to which the extent to which you can identify projects that align with AB 32, the state's greenhouse gas regulation law. The idea of ensuring that this further state expenditure of the funds further states priorities, that allows you, the legislature, to make sure that there's consistency in state actions, so we're not taking contradictory actions, or conversely, that we're possibly achieving more of the state's environmental goals with the same project. The second principle for implementing the bond that we've identified would be to fund cost-effective projects for the state. And so what we mean by that is that there are actually a couple of key pieces to that. The first one of those would be to ensure that the bond dollars go to projects that provide state-level public benefits. So the thinking behind that is that, well, state taxpayers as a whole are paying for this bond over time, and so the projects that are funded with that money should provide a benefit to the state as a whole. What that also means is that, in general, bond funds should not be prioritized for projects that have identified or specific beneficiaries, organizations, people that benefit directly from those. A second key point of ensuring cost-effective projects for the state would be to ensure that you're generating benefits above what otherwise would have occurred. So in some cases, there are regulatory requirements. Certainly, state bond funds in most cases shouldn't support activities that meet existing regulatory requirements. You may want to focus on funding long-term projects and, related to that, limiting the costs of administration for the bond. And then finally, just recognizing that there are going to be trade-offs among some of these different principles, and just more generally with other state priorities. The last key principle that we've identified would be to ensure accountability and oversight, and just generally accountability we think is important for promoting transparency. It can also provide departments that are giving out funds, as well as the grantees that are receiving funds, with an additional incentive to either select better projects or implement those projects more effectively. Essentially, if they know that the legislature has an interest and is focusing on what are we going to get out of this, what is the outcome, they may be more likely to focus their efforts on that. So one way to do that would be to have departments collect and evaluate data on project outcomes, as well as programs as a whole. And that will essentially allow the legislature and the voters to understand what it is that they bought with their bond dollars. A couple of options as you consider ways to do this might be to add additional reporting requirements on how projects are selected, or the outcomes that the projects are intended to achieve. You might want to establish ongoing monitoring and evaluation programs, and in some cases you might want to seek third-party evaluations, such as those done by academic researchers, to take a look at broader programs. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Mr. Favarini-Sorba, thank you very much for your presentation, as well as the written complement to that presentation, which should be a guidebook for anyone engaged in oversight on this project. I want to jump right into a question that came up early in your presentation, which is the Water Commission and ensuring accountability on the $2.7 billion with which they've been entrusted to spend wisely. Can you comment on that?
So I think what you want to, some of the factors that you might want to consider as you're looking at what the Water Commission plans to do. And so as just a little bit of background, their process is the bond requires the Water Commission to identify public benefits associated with water storage projects. So water storage projects can include surface reservoirs, dams, but it can also include groundwater projects. And the public benefits that are laid out in the bond fall into 5 categories. Some examples are ecosystem restoration. So if a project provides more flows in say, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, that might be considered a public benefit. The Commission is currently in the process of developing how it's going to identify and value those public benefits. As you're looking at what the Commission's going to do, you might want to think about, well, so there are these 5 categories of public benefits more broadly. Where is the state-level public benefit that's the interest there? So you may want to ask the Commission, for instance, how it plans to identify a state-level public benefit rather than, say, a local public benefit, a benefit for a community or something like that. I think oversight hearings might be a valuable tool.
Thank you. Mr. Ridley-Thomas?
Yes, Mr. Favarini-Sorba.
You got it.
Silency. All right. Has the LAO performed any analysis of the drought relief package's impact prior to the passage of Prop 1?
We are in the process of analyzing that package. We should have some recommendations in the next couple of weeks on those specifically.
And was that your project?
And I also, I'm the one that is engaged in that.
So I think there was a news article yesterday that suggested that Los Angeles and, Southern California wasn't getting as much rainfall as Northern California, so that the drought conditions and challenges with access to water were continuing to be exacerbated in Central California to Southern California. Any ideas or thoughts about that as we go into further Prop 1 conversations today?
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with the specific water the latest water conditions. I think generally some of the concern or some of the ways to think about this might be obviously we have a very interconnected water system. We move a lot of water from north to south, so just thinking broadly about statewide water conditions is important. Really, I think ultimately we won't know exactly how much our resource needs will be until we see kind of the final water measurements in April. And at that point, then I think that'll be a good opportunity for the legislature to look and see what conditions are on the ground, whether we received additional rain or did not, will significantly affect how much we need to do.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Williams.
So I was looking at your recommendations and hearing you reiterate them, and so you made a recommendation on cost effectiveness, essentially dollar per how much water you can produce or free up, and GHG impact, which you could really look at it from an energy efficiency standpoint, both being criteria that should be used. So in areas where these technologies are competing, like the recycled water portion, which is dovetailed with desal, if I molded your recommendations, to me that sounds like we should be very discriminating, and local agencies should also be very discriminating in instances where we could produce more recycled water per dollar than we could produce desaled water per dollar, and that the state obviously gets more water per dollar with secondary plus treated recycled water than desalinization, for example.
I think in general we will want to consider what the costs of each and benefits of each specific project are. In the particular case of water recycling and desalination, there can be a wide range in those cost values, and so I think it'll be incumbent on the grantees and on the departments that are administering those funds to ensure that they're distributed to projects that are cost effective, and that there aren't better projects even within the same area perhaps that money could go to. So robust analysis of the alternatives in those cases.
Any further questions? Mr. Gallagher?
Yeah, something that you just said earlier in your presentation, I had a question about, because you were saying that ecosystem restoration projects could be funded under the $2.7 billion it's set aside for water storage. And though I agree that there's discussion in the public benefits that, the public benefits of these projects should have ecosystem improvements in them, there's actually 5 criteria. There are ecosystem improvements, water quality improvements in the delta, flood control benefits, emergency response, and recreational purposes. However, the prerequisites in Section 8 of the bond make it very clear that these are eligible for funding under the chapter. Projects which the public benefits are eligible for funding under this chapter consist of only the following. And this is our language. This is the legislature's language, and I think one big part is that we ensure that the language that we put together, that was part of what I understand very in-depth negotiations and discussions, is followed. And it's very clear that it's only for surface storage projects, groundwater storage projects, conjunctive use and reservoir reoperation projects, and local and regional surface storage projects that improve the operation of water systems and the status quo. And what I don't want to happen is that, and as you pointed out earlier in your presentation, there is almost $1.5 billion in the bond for watershed and protecting rivers, lakes, and streams. So there is money for the things you described. What I don't want to happen is that we start funding ecosystem restoration projects that aren't part of the storage component of this bond, and I think we need to take that oversight very seriously. Do you have any comment or thoughts on that part of it?
Nothing to add, except you're exactly right that the projects that are eligible for funding are the water storage projects, and they may have ecosystem benefits, and so, but. Absolutely right in that these funds need to be spent in accordance with the directions that are laid out in the bond.
And so that's what I meant. I mean, you described a project, an ecosystem restoration project somewhere that improved flows. Well, that's great that it would improve flows. I think there's money for that under the $1.5 million, but that's not a storage project, as is identified. That's the purpose of this $2.7 billion. Is that correct?
That is correct to the extent that there are certain storage projects that might have a result of increased flows, but it needs
That's my concern right there, and I think we really need to pay close attention.
Great, yeah, thank you, Mr. Gallagher, and thanks for your good answer on that, Mr. Favorini-Zorba. If we read the text of the law for surface storage projects, it actually defines that and it is inclusive of ecosystem improvements for public benefit. So it's pretty clear in the law. Are there any further questions for Mr. Vavarini-Sorba? Mr. Gray.
Well, first of all, thank you, Mr. Chair, for conducting, I think, a very important oversight hearing. Certainly lots of questions in my part of the world where agriculture is our #1 industry. There are those of us that engaged heavily in the negotiations and advocacy on the water bond to ensure that there would, in fact, be surface storage, and specifically dam surface storage. I was elected in 2012. If the voters keep me around, I may be able to stay here till 2024. Am I going to see the completion of a surface storage project during my tenure here?
These projects are certainly complex, and they can take some time. I think the first step is whether the funding, so the Commission, certainly surface storage projects are eligible, groundwater storage projects are also eligible under the measure. The Commission is the one that ultimately will decide what projects are funded, and so whether or not it decides to go with surface storage or groundwater storage is one consideration. The measure also does include some restrictions on on a date before which no funds can be spent, and that I believe was 2018, although I'd have to double check.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I think the legislature rightly has an interest in seeing these funds get spent on projects as quickly as possible.
So I could put you down for a maybe?
All right, let's remember that the current witness is here to help us engage in oversight. It's the agencies who are coming up next who have been sufficiently put on notice that they will be in the hot seat in a couple of minutes.
Mr. Chair,
but good
I appreciate
questions.
that reminder, and I will reserve some heat for them as well.
Please do. Please do. Mr. Dodd.
Mr. Chair, with that admonishment, I will wait.
All right, without any further questions, sir, thank you so much for your presentation. You will certainly be welcome back in the future.
Thank you very much.
And as we move next for our agency representatives who will now come up, I'd also like to provide an opportunity for Mr. Gomez and Medina to add on to the vote for AJR 4.
Okay, AJR 4 be adopted. The current vote is 8-4 with the chair voting aye. The absent members were Mr. Gomez. Aye. Gomez, aye. Medina?
Aye.
Medina, aye. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So thank you again, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'm hoping that the purpose of this panel, there's multiple purposes, but for what we're trying to do, I'm hoping to keep this informal and conversational, and to learn about how you intend to roll out Prop 1 funding and what types of strategies you will place to ensure accountability, as we've tried to frame this hearing. To help keep this moving briskly, we've provided a brief biography for each of you so that you don't have to cover that part. As much as we'd all like to hear you recount your life story or what you ate for breakfast. But we want to really get to the meat and the heart of what we're trying to talk about today. Members, those bios are on the blue sheet in your packet. We've also posted that document, as well as many others, on the committee's internet website for anyone who is watching this hearing online. We are very fortunate to have with us today, and honored to have with us Secretary Laird. So we will begin with you, and then if other speakers could proceed in the order listed on our agenda, that would be fantastic. We'll hear from each of you, and then we'll take questions from our members. Thank you.